There is a story about this city that has been told and retold for 50 years, in books and documentaries and late-night arguments in pubs, and it goes like this. In November of 1940, British codebreakers secretly listening to German radio traffic learned that the Luftwaffe was about to launch one of the most devastating air raids of the entire war, and that the target was a quiet English cathedral city in the Midlands. And the story says that Winston Churchill, told of the coming catastrophe, made a cold and terrible calculation. If he ordered extra defences into the city, or evacuated its people, the Germans might realise their supposedly unbreakable code had been broken, and Britain's single greatest intelligence advantage of the entire war would be lost. So, the story goes, he said nothing. He let the city burn, to keep a secret. 600 people died that night, and for decades afterwards, some believed their deaths had been the price of an unspoken bargain made in a war room by a man who never told them the choice had even been made. It is one of the most chilling stories in the whole of British history, and as you are about to find out, the true story is not the one that is usually told, but it is, in its own way, sadder still. This is the city of Coventry, and on a single night in November 1940, it suffered the most concentrated bombing raid inflicted on any British city in the entire war, an attack so total that the Nazi propaganda ministry coined a brand new German word to describe it, to Coventrate, meaning to erase a place from the map entirely. Its medieval cathedral, one of the finest in England, was reduced to a shell of blackened stone in a single night, and for generations since, the city that suffered that catastrophe has also had to carry the weight of a rumour, a story that it was somehow sacrificed on purpose, chosen, betrayed by its own government to protect a secret. How do you tell the difference between the true story of a tragedy and the legend that grows up around it, when the legend is almost more terrible than the truth? This is the rise and fall of Coventry. To understand what was really lost here on that one impossible night, you first have to understand what Coventry actually was, because the rumour of betrayal has, in a strange way, overshadowed one of the most extraordinary stories of invention and reinvention in the whole of British history. This is not simply a story about a bombing raid, it is the story of a city that reinvented itself completely, not once but twice, and of what it cost the second time, when the enemy that came for it was not a bomber at all. Coventry begins, as English cities so often do, with a legend that has outgrown the truth. In the 11th century, an Anglo-Saxon nobleman named Leofric, Earl of Mercia, and his wife, a noblewoman we know as Lady Godiva, founded a Benedictine monastery here on the banks of a small river called the Sherborne. The story that would one day make Godiva's name famous across the world, that she rode naked through the streets of the town to persuade her husband to lower crushing taxes on its people, was not written down until more than a century after her death, and historians today doubt it happened as the legend describes. But the legend tells you something true about the town itself, even if it never happened exactly that way. Coventry was, from the very beginning, a place associated with the relationship between power and ordinary people, between a ruler and the taxed and the burdened. It would not be the last time that relationship defined the city's story. What made Coventry real, rather than legendary, was wool. The gentle hills of the English Midlands around the town were superb country for grazing sheep, and by the end of the 14th century, the trade in fine Midlands fleece had made Coventry one of the wealthiest cities in the entire kingdom, reckoned by some counts to be the fourth most powerful city in all of England, behind only London, York, and Bristol. The wealth from that wool paved its streets and raised its churches. Coventry became a centre of pilgrimage, home to houses of the Benedictines, the Carthusians, the Carmelites, and the Franciscans, and in 1345 it was granted a royal charter, one of the first towns in England to win the right to govern itself, its merchants, wealthy enough by then to build not one, but two great parish churches within sight of each other, a rare mark of civic confidence in medieval England. At the heart of this wealthy, walled, pious medieval city stood the greater of the two, St. Michael's, one of the largest parish churches in England, its soaring spire visible for miles across the flat Midlands countryside. Remember that spire. It is the one thing that connects everything that happens in this story, from beginning to end. The wool trade, like every single commodity fortune this channel has ever traced, eventually faded, undercut by wool from elsewhere and by changing fashions in cloth. Coventry's weavers turned to finer work, silk ribbons in particular, a trade that drew skilled Huguenot refugees fleeing persecution in France. And alongside the silk trade grew something quieter and, in the end, far more consequential: watchmaking. Coventry became known across Britain for the precision and delicacy of its watchmakers' hands, men trained to work with tiny, exact, interlocking parts. It was a trade that seemed to belong to a gentler, more old-fashioned England. It was about to accidentally deliver the city into the modern age, because when watchmaking itself began to decline in the middle of the 19th century, undercut by cheaper machine-made watches from Switzerland and America, Coventry did not simply lose the skill its watchmakers had spent generations perfecting, it transferred it. A new craze was sweeping the country in the 1860s and 70s, the bicycle, a machine that depended entirely on the same qualities that had made a Coventry watch famous: precise, light, perfectly machined metal parts, made by hands that would not accept anything less than exact. The city's redundant watchmakers became the country's finest cycle engineers almost overnight. In 1885, in Coventry, an engineer named John Kemp Starley built what became known as the Rover safety bicycle. The machine with two equal-sized wheels and a chain drive that is, in essence, the ancestor of every bicycle made anywhere in the world today. By the closing years of the 19th century, Coventry did not merely make bicycles. Coventry had, quietly and almost by accident, become the town that taught the whole world how to build one. And then, in 1896, the bicycle makers of Coventry looked at the same problem from a new angle, and the city was reborn a second time. That year, the Daimler company set up in a disused cotton mill in the city and began building Britain's first production motor cars. The logic was irresistible. A car, at the turn of the century, was really just a bicycle's precision engineering wedded to an engine, and nobody in Britain had more of that precision engineering, or more idle capacity to build it, than Coventry. Cycle makers turned, one after another, into car makers. Rover did it, Triumph did it. So did dozens of smaller firms that would grow into household names: Humber, Standard, Singer, Riley, Alvis, Armstrong Siddeley, Leah Francis, Swift. By 1913, there were 23 separate motor manufacturers at work inside this one Midlands city, an astonishing concentration of engineering firms crammed into a town you could walk across in under an hour. Coventry had done what almost no other town in this whole story ever managed. It had reinvented its entire economy, cleanly and completely. Not once but twice. Riding the wool trade, then the watch and silk trade, then bicycles, and finally the motor car, without ever losing its footing, each new industry growing directly out of the skills the last one had left behind. There was a restless, inventive energy running through the whole city in these years that went well beyond simply assembling cars. Coventry engineers pushed into aircraft engines and armaments almost as readily as they pushed into motor cars, and the city's workshops became a genuine cradle of British engineering talent more broadly, the kind of place where a clever apprentice with steady hands and a good eye could rise from the factory floor into genuine invention. It was this exact culture, precise, practical, endlessly adaptable, that would one day produce Frank Whittle's jet engine, born from an engineering imagination shaped by growing up in a city where reinventing an entire industry from scratch was simply what people did when the old one ran its course. By the early decades of the 20th century, Coventry had become, in the most literal sense, Britain's Detroit. Immigrants poured in from across the country, drawn by wages that ran well above the national average. Families like the Whittles, whose son Frank would grow up in the engineering culture of the city and go on to invent the jet engine. A dozen major car manufacturers operated within the city limits by 1950, alongside firms making aircraft engines, machine tools, and, as war approached again, munitions. Nearly two-thirds of the working population of the city would come to depend, directly or indirectly, on the motor trade. Women made up a far higher share of that workforce than almost anywhere else in the country, precision assembly work suiting the same delicate hands that had once made watches and cycles. Picture the city on an ordinary weekday morning in that golden decade before the war. The streets around the factory gates fill before dawn with men and women on bicycles, thousands of them streaming in from the terraced streets, the same kind of bicycle the city itself had taught the world to build a generation earlier, carrying its workers to jobs, making the very cars that would one day replace the bicycle in every driveway in Britain. Inside the Daimler works and the Standard works and the Humber works, the noise never lets up, presses stamping steel, engines being timed and tested, the whole vast machinery of a modern industrial economy running at full tilt. And in the evenings, wages in hand, the same streets fill again, with a prosperity that was, by the standards of provincial England, almost unheard of. A Coventry engineering family could own things, save things, plan things, in a way that a family in a struggling mill town or a played-out mining valley simply could not. This was a city that believed, with real justification, that it had cracked the code of permanent, self-renewing prosperity. A city that had already reinvented itself twice, and saw no reason it could not do so forever. Walk through Coventry in the 1930s, and you would have found a city living two lives at once. And this is the detail that matters most to everything that follows. Around the great spire of St. Michael's, the medieval city still stood, a genuine, ancient, walled English town of timber-framed houses and narrow lanes that dated back centuries. One observer in 1920 calling it among the best-preserved medieval towns anywhere in Europe, and spreading out from that old heart, in every direction, ran the modern city, factory after factory, wages so good that a Coventry working man could, by the standards of the age, live extraordinarily well. Two entirely different centuries, standing side by side within the same set of walls. And here is the detail almost nobody remembers, the twist that changes the whole meaning of what happened next. Even before a single German bomb fell on Coventry, the city itself, and its own planners, had already begun to clear away its medieval past. The narrow ancient streets could not carry the traffic or the ambitions of a booming 20th century industrial city, and by the early 1930s, the bulldozers were already at work, widening roads, clearing old buildings, reshaping Coventry for the age of the motor car it had itself created. Photographs from that decade showed timber-framed houses that had stood since the Middle Ages coming down under the pickaxe on the orders of the city's own council, not an invading army. In the name of a modern future, the city was in a hurry to reach. The modern city was, in a sense, already quietly erasing the old one, more than a decade before the Luftwaffe ever appeared over the Midlands. What the bombs did in November 1940 did not begin a process of loss. It violently, catastrophically accelerated one that Coventry's own prosperity had already set in motion. Because that same prosperity, that same status as the beating heart of British engineering, made Coventry a target the moment the war began. A city that built the engines of tanks and the airframes of fighters was never going to be left alone once the bombing started. And the city knew it, air raid shelters and barrage balloons becoming as much a part of the Coventry skyline by the autumn of 1940 as the factory chimneys themselves. And on the night of the 14th of November 1940, it was not left alone at all. The Luftwaffe called the operation Moonlight Sonata. It was planned to coincide with a full moon, bright enough for bombers to navigate by sight over a blacked-out England, and it was aimed squarely at Coventry's factories, the very engines of the war effort the city had spent 40 years building. Just after 7 in the evening, the air raid sirens began, and for the next 11 hours, without a single meaningful pause, nearly 500 German bombers came over the city in relentless waves, guided in by a small group of specially equipped Pathfinder aircraft flying along an invisible radio beam that led, with terrible precision, straight to the heart of Coventry. They dropped roughly 500 tons of high explosive, some 50 parachute landmines, and around 30,000 incendiary bombs, small and light, and falling by the thousand, catching in roofs and timbers all across the old town at once. The Luftwaffe was trying something new that night too, an early exploding incendiary designed to kill the very fire watchers whose job was to stamp the fires out. Down below, the medieval city, the one that had stood for the better part of 1,000 years, began to burn from 100 separate points simultaneously, and there were simply not enough hands in the whole of Coventry to fight that many fires at once. Water pressure in the mains failed, as pipe after pipe was shattered by blast, so that firemen who did reach a burning building often found nothing but a trickle coming out of the hose. The telephone exchange was hit, and much of the city's communications went dark in the middle of the raid, so that fire crews were, for long stretches, simply driving toward the worst of the glow and hoping it was the right direction. The great spire of St. Michael's, the one thing every citizen of the city could see from anywhere on a clear day, watched its own cathedral die around it that night. The nave collapsed in flames. The roof came down. By the following morning, St. Michael's stood roofless and gutted, the only English cathedral destroyed in the entire war. And yet, in one of those strange, aching details history sometimes hands us, its tall Gothic spire remained standing, untouched, rising up out of the smoking ruin below it, exactly as it always had, visible for miles, as though the city's oldest landmark had simply refused to fall. 568 people were killed that single night, families crushed in their homes, fire watchers caught in the open, ambulance crews working through streets they no longer recognized, an 11-hour ordeal that damaged or destroyed some 43,000 houses, roughly half of every home in the city. The Daimler works alone took 150 high-explosive bombs and 3,000 incendiaries, 15 acres of factory reduced to a raging inferno in a single night, the fire visible, and the heat and the smell of it detectable, in the cockpits of bombers still circling 6,000 feet above, long after their own bomb bays were empty. When it was finally over, at midday the next day, the sky over the city was still so thick with smoke that it was almost dark, though the temperature, from the sheer heat of the fires, felt like spring. King George VI came to walk through the ruins in the days that followed, and is said to have wept openly at what he saw. Hundreds of shell-shocked residents wandered the smoking streets in a daze. It was reported that small children, disoriented and terrified, tried to burrow their way through solid brick walls, as though the whole world itself had come apart, and they were simply looking for a way back into it. Rescue workers dug through the rubble of collapsed houses for days afterwards, working by torchlight through the nights, uncertain, street by street, how many more of their neighbors still lay beneath the bricks. In the panic and grief of the days immediately afterwards, as much as half the population of the city fled to the surrounding countryside, unwilling to spend another night under a sky that had done this. Nazi propagandists in Berlin, thrilled with the scale of the destruction, coined an entirely new word to describe it: Coventrian, to Coventrate, to wipe a place from the map with such totality that its name itself became a verb for annihilation. The word would go on to be used, again and again, of other cities across the rest of the war, but it was born here, over Coventry, on this one impossible night. If the story of Britain's forgotten places means something to you, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is one of the few things that keeps a place like this from being forgotten twice. This channel brings the lost history of Britain's great towns and cities back to life, the places that built the modern world and were then quietly left behind by it. Now we have to go back and answer the question this whole story began with: did Britain know this was coming and let it happen anyway? Here the honest historian has to be very careful, because the truth is more tangled and in its own way more human than the legend that has replaced it. The rumor that Churchill knowingly sacrificed Coventry to protect the Enigma secret began, almost entirely, with one book. In 1974, a former RAF officer named Frederick Winterbotham published a memoir called The Ultra Secret, one of the very first accounts to reveal to the public that Britain had broken Germany's Enigma codes at all. Winterbotham's role in the war had been to manage the distribution of decoded Enigma material to field commanders. He was not a codebreaker himself, and he was writing from memory some 34 years after the events he described. In his book, he claimed flatly that the ultra-decrypts had identified Coventry by name as the target well in advance, and that Churchill had personally ordered no special defensive measures be taken, precisely so the Germans would never suspect their code had been cracked. It is a gripping story. It is also, according to the people who were actually in the room, simply not true. The scientist Reginald Victor Jones, who led Britain's efforts to detect and jam the German navigational beams the bombers used to find their targets, stated plainly that the codebreakers had not identified Coventry as the target in time for any such decision to be made. Peter Calvocaressi, who ran the air section at Bletchley Park that translated the decoded Luftwaffe signals, was equally direct. Ultra, he said, never mentioned Coventry. What the intelligence actually showed, according to the official record kept by Britain's own Signals Intelligence Service, was genuinely tangled and uncertain, not a cold, clear choice at all. On the 11th of November, a decrypted message revealed that a major operation, codenamed Moonlight Sonata, was being planned to coincide with the next full moon. The following day, a captured German airman told a fellow prisoner, secretly wired for sound, that the targets were to be Coventry and Birmingham. But that same day, a separate captured document suggested the targets were 4 locations in or around London, and intelligence officers judged that interpretation just as credible as the other. Britain's air staff warned Churchill only that a major raid was probably coming, probably somewhere near London, adding that if better information pointed to Coventry, Birmingham, or elsewhere, they hoped to get instructions out in time. There simply was no clean, single, unambiguous warning naming Coventry that Churchill could have acted on and chose to ignore. There was fog, contradiction, and a desperate, failing race against the clock, and in the final hours before the raid itself, the flow of new ultra-intelligence went completely silent, with a gap in the decrypts running from the early hours of the 13th of November right through until after the bombers were already in the air on the 14th. Nor is it true that Britain simply did nothing. Fighters were scrambled, anti-aircraft guns were readied. Above all, Jones's own scientists worked frantically to jam the German radio beams, codenamed X-Gerät, that the Luftwaffe's Pathfinder aircraft used to find their target in the dark, with pinpoint accuracy. The jamming failed that night, and it failed for a mundane, almost bureaucratic reason that has nothing to do with any grand conspiracy at all. British jamming equipment had been calibrated to the wrong frequency, and the Luftwaffe had recently and quietly switched its receivers to a new, narrower band that Britain's scientists did not yet know to counter. It was a technical failure, a step behind in an invisible, fast-moving war of beams and frequencies that had been raging in the skies for months, not a deliberate stand-down ordered from above. So here is the myth, corrected, and it deserves to be said plainly. Winston Churchill did not know Coventry was the target of the 14th of November raid and choose to let it burn to protect a secret. The evidence does not support it, and the people who were actually inside British intelligence at the time have spent decades saying so. But notice what the true story actually is, because it is not simply a comforting alternative to the dark one. It is, in its own way, just as unsettling. Coventry was not sacrificed by a calculating mind making a terrible, deliberate choice. It was lost in a fog of ambiguous intelligence, crossed wires, and a technical failure in an invisible electronic war that nobody in the city itself could ever have known was even being fought over their heads that night. There was no villain in the room making a cold decision about who would live and who would die. There was simply confusion and bad luck, and a jamming system tuned to the wrong frequency, and by the time anyone understood what was actually happening, the bombers were already there. Somehow, that is harder to sit with than the conspiracy, not easier. A secret betrayal at least has a reason behind it. What actually happened to Coventry had no reason at all. And Coventry's second catastrophe, the one that came after the myth, after the ruins were cleared and the city rebuilt, had no single dramatic villain either. It happened much more slowly, and it happened, this time, entirely without an enemy of any kind, in the very industry that had made the city what it was. The rebuilding itself was, by any measure, a genuine triumph, and it happened astonishingly fast. Within weeks of the Blitz, against every expectation of the government, which had feared that a raid of this scale might permanently break civilian morale, Coventry's factories were working again. A young city architect named Donald Gibson had, remarkably, already been drawing up plans to modernize the war-damaged center before the bombs even fell, and after the raid, those plans found their moment. Broadgate, at the heart of the city, opened as the first fully reconstructed civic space in Britain, and around it rose one of Europe's very first purpose-built, traffic-free shopping precincts, an idea that would eventually be copied by cities across the world. The car industry, the thing the bombers had actually been trying to destroy, roared back stronger than ever. By the 1950s and 60s, Coventry stood at the absolute peak of its second life. A dozen manufacturers turning out Jaguars and Humbers and Hillmans and Triumphs, wages in the city's car plants running a full quarter above the national industrial average, women making up nearly 40% of that well-paid workforce, a proportion almost unheard of anywhere else in the country. Between 1962 and 1964 alone, Britain built well over 370,000 vehicles a year and stood as the largest car exporter on Earth, and an enormous share of that output rolled out of Coventry's gates. The bombed city had not merely recovered, it had, for a shining couple of decades, become richer and prouder than it had ever been before the war. And then, quietly, without a single bomb falling, it all came apart again. The trouble began exactly where it always begins in these stories: total dependence on one industry, at the very moment that industry was changing beyond recognition. Foreign manufacturers, first in Europe and then in Japan, began building better cars, more reliably, more cheaply, than Coventry's aging plants and often fractious labor relations could match. In 1968, the great sprawling merger that created British Leyland swallowed up firm after Coventry firm, Triumph, Rover, Jaguar, folded together into a single, chronically troubled conglomerate that within a few years the government itself had to step in and part nationalize just to keep it alive. The 1970s brought strikes, walkouts, and industrial chaos that became, fairly or not, a national byword for everything that critics said was wrong with British manufacturing. And underneath the headlines about industrial unrest, a harder and more permanent kind of damage was already being done. Between 1975 and 1982 alone, the 15 largest employers in Coventry cut a combined total of around 55,000 jobs between them, an average of some 500 jobs disappearing from the city every single month for the better part of a decade. In August 1980, the last Triumph Spitfire rolled off the line at the Canley Works, and the plant closed for good. 50 years of Triumph car production in the city, ending not with an explosion, but with a quiet whistle at the end of a shift. Unemployment in Coventry climbed to 17% by the middle of the decade, among the very worst in the country, in a city that a generation earlier had boasted some of the highest wages in Britain. The devastation was so total and so widely recognized that in 1981, a Coventry band called The Specials released a single that became a #1 hit across the whole of the country, a bleak, haunting song about the collapse of a British industrial town that they simply, bluntly, called Ghost Town. It became the unofficial anthem of a decade of British decline, and it was written about this city. The bleeding did not stop there. Jaguar finally moved production out of its historic Browns Lane plant in the middle of the 2000s. Peugeot, which had bought out the old Roots Group's factory at Ryton, closed and demolished it in 2006, shifting the remaining jobs to a plant in Slovakia. At its peak in the 1970s, the single Ryton works alone had employed some 30,000 people. 2/3 of the entire working population of Coventry had once depended on the motor trade the city itself had invented. By the middle of the 2000s, the volume car manufacturing that had defined the city for 100 years had all but vanished from it. So here is the honest reckoning on Coventry, and it has two very different parts, because this city's story genuinely has two separate collapses, and they call for two separate verdicts. The Blitz was not a betrayal. It was a tragedy of war, confusion, and bad technical luck, inflicted by an enemy that Coventry had no power to resist, and nobody in this city bears any responsibility at all for what happened to them on that one impossible night. But the second collapse, the slow bleeding away of the car industry across the 1970s, 80s, and 2000s, is a more complicated story, with real argument on both sides. Some point to genuinely fierce, fairly won foreign competition, and to years of self-inflicted industrial chaos, strikes and poor investment and management failures that no government could reasonably have been expected to indefinitely subsidize. Others point to a wider, harsher political abandonment of British manufacturing across those same decades, the same brutal reckoning that hollowed out the coalfields and the shipyards, falling here on a city that had reinvented itself twice already and asked only to be allowed to do so a third time. Both things can be true at once. What is not in dispute is the human cost. 55,000 jobs gone from a handful of streets in under a decade, and a city that had risen from actual ashes in 1940, finding itself, 40 years later, ground down again by a much slower and much quieter kind of fire. And yet, this is not quite where the story ends, because Coventry, having already reinvented itself twice, has never stopped trying to answer the question of what it should become next. Stand today, where the ruins of old St. Michael's still stand, because the city made a remarkable choice about what to do with them. Rather than clear the bombed cathedral away entirely, Coventry kept its roofless walls standing exactly as the fire left them, a permanent, open-air ruin at the very center of the modern city, and beside it, in 1962, a completely new cathedral was consecrated, a bold, modern building in red sandstone designed by the architect Basil Spence, its interior filled with a vast tapestry of Christ by Graham Sutherland and a bronze sculpture by Jacob Epstein. The two buildings, the ancient ruin and the new cathedral, stand connected side by side, one never replacing the other, both simply telling the truth about what happened here. And Coventry made its cathedral into something more than a building. It became, quite deliberately, a world center for reconciliation. The city reached out first to Stalingrad and then to Dresden, the German city that would itself be devastated by Allied bombing later in the same war, and the two former enemies became sister cities, exchanging visits, mourning together, rebuilding a relationship out of the wreckage each had made of the other. Coventry took the very word the Nazis had coined to celebrate its destruction and turned the whole city, in the decades that followed, into a living argument for peace instead. And that great spire, the one you were asked to remember at the very start of this story, the one that watched its own cathedral burn and yet somehow refused to fall, still stands today, exactly where it has stood for 600 years, visible across the whole of the rebuilt city, over the ring road and the shopping precincts and the empty spaces where the car plants used to roar. Coventry has been erased and rebuilt more times than almost any city in this whole Channel's story, first by its own hand, clearing its medieval streets before the bombs ever came, then by fire, in 11 hours that a haunted myth has spent 50 years misremembering, and then, slowly and quietly, by the closing of 100 factory gates with no bombs falling at all. And every single time, the spire was still there afterwards, and so, in the end, were the people. If you have walked with this story all the way to the end, then you already know this channel is for you. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one, We uncover a different lost British town or city every week, and there are far more of them than you would ever think. The next one is waiting for you on screen right now.